The coffee mug hit the floor with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through every corner of Sunrise Diner, its brown liquid spreading across the worn linoleum like spilled regret. Maya Rodriguez didn't flinch. She had learned to measure disasters in degrees, and broken ceramic ranked somewhere between a burnt pancake and a no-show cook, which meant manageable but exhausting. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Are you completely incompetent or just pretending to be? The man's voice cut through the usual morning chatter of truckers and early commuters with the precision of a blade. He sat alone in Booth 7, the one by the window that looked out onto Highway 34, wearing an expensive charcoal suit that seemed out of place among the flannel shirts and work boots that typically filled the diner's red vinyl seats. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his watch caught the fluorescent light with each dismissive gesture, and his pale blue eyes held the kind of cold anger that Maya had learned to recognize in people who had never been told no. "Sir, I'm so sorry," Maya said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt building in her chest. She knelt to gather the ceramic shards, her worn sneakers squeaking against the floor. The coffee was already seeping into the cracks between the tiles, another stain that would join the constellation of mishaps that marked this place like a map of small tragedies. "I'll get you a fresh cup right away, and there's no charge for it." "Do you think I care about the charge?" His laugh was sharp, humorless. "I've been waiting 15 minutes for a simple cup of coffee. 15 minutes. I have a meeting in Davenport that's worth more than you'll make in a year, and you're here fumbling around like some amateur." The diner had gone quiet in that particular way that happens when everyone pretends not to listen while hanging on every word. At the counter, Harold Peterson, a regular who came in every Tuesday for his usual stack of pancakes and black coffee, had paused mid-bite, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Behind the pass-through window, she could see Carlos, the morning cook, shaking his head with the weary expression of someone who had witnessed this scene play out in various forms countless times. "I understand you're frustrated," Maya said, rising slowly to her feet, the broken pieces cradled in her palm. A thin line of blood appeared where one shard had nicked her thumb, but she didn't let it show on her face. "I'll get you that coffee, and I'll make sure it's exactly how you like it." "How I like it?" The man leaned back in the booth, his expression shifting from anger to something approaching disgust. "How about competent service? How about hiring people who can actually do their jobs instead of welfare cases playing dress-up as waitresses?" The words hit Maya like a physical blow, but she had learned long ago to absorb such impacts without visible reaction. She thought of Emma, her 8-year-old daughter, who would be getting ready for school right now in their small apartment above Rodriguez Auto Repair, probably deciding between the Lucky Unicorn t-shirt and the one with the constellation pattern that she'd earned for perfect attendance. Emma, who still believed that fairness was a law of nature and kindness was the default setting of human hearts. "I'll be right back with your coffee," Maya said quietly, turning toward the kitchen. "Don't bother," he called after her, his voice carrying easily across the small space. "I'll take my business somewhere that values customers who can actually pay their bills." He stood, throwing a $5 bill on the table with deliberate contempt, and walked toward the door. The bell above it gave its familiar cheerful chime as he pushed through, a sound so at odds with the tension he left behind that it seemed almost mocking. "You okay, honey?" The voice belonged to Dolores Martinez, a woman in her 60s who had been coming to the diner since before Maya started working there. Dolores had the kind of face that spoke of a lifetime spent listening to other people's troubles and offering what comfort she could. Deep brown eyes that crinkled at the corners, silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and hands that always seemed to be reaching out to pat someone's arm or squeeze their shoulder. "I'm fine," Maya said automatically, the response as worn smooth as the diner's countertop from years of repetition. "No, you're not," Dolores said gently. "And that's okay. That man was out of line." Harold cleared his throat from his position at the counter. "More than out of line?" he said, his voice carrying the authority of his 73 years and 4 decades as the town's only practicing attorney before his retirement. That was harassment, plain and simple. People like that, Carlos called from the kitchen, appearing at the pass-through with a fresh pot of coffee. They think money gives them the right to treat other people like garbage, but karma has a way of catching up. Maya managed to smile, the expression feeling fragile on her face. Thanks, everyone. Really. But I'm used to it. The truth was, she was used to it. In the 3 years since David had left, taking with him not just their marriage, but their savings account, their shared dreams, and any illusions Maya might have had about the fundamental decency of people, she had encountered more variations of cruelty than she had ever imagined possible. There were the subtle dismissals, the casual assumptions about her intelligence, the loaded questions about Emma's father that carried judgment wrapped in false concern. There were the customers who left messes deliberately, who complained about service that was perfectly adequate, who seemed to take pleasure in wielding whatever small power they had over someone they perceived as powerless. But this morning felt different somehow. Maybe it was the way the man had looked at her, not just with contempt, but with a kind of predatory satisfaction, as if her discomfort was entertainment. Maybe it was the specific words he'd chosen, each one calculated to cut deep. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired, bone-deep tired, in the way that comes from working 60-hour weeks while trying to be both mother and father to a little girl who deserved so much more than what Maya could provide. She walked to the back of the diner, past the booth where the man had sat, and noticed something glinting on the floor. Bending down, she found a small silver cufflink, ornate and expensive-looking, with what appeared to be initials engraved on its surface. R.H. It must have fallen from his sleeve when he gestured so dismissively. Maya picked it up, turning it over in her palm. The metal was heavy, real silver by the feel of it, and the craftsmanship was exquisite. This single cufflink probably cost more than she made in a week. For a moment, she considered throwing it away, letting it disappear into the dumpster behind the diner with the coffee grounds and breakfast scraps. It would be a small, petty revenge, barely even satisfying. Instead, she slipped it into her apron pocket. Tomorrow was Emma's field trip to the State Museum, and Maya was still $20 short of the fee. She could probably pawn this for enough to cover it, maybe even have a little left over for the lunch Emma would need to pack. The rest of the morning passed in its familiar rhythm. Truckers ordered eggs over easy and hash browns, commuters grabbed coffee and Danish to go, and the regular crowd of retirees settled in for their daily debate about everything from local politics to the weather forecast. Maya moved through it all with practiced efficiency, refilling coffee cups, delivering plates of food, and making small talk that felt genuine even when she was running on empty. But the encounter with the man in the expensive suit lingered at the edges of her consciousness like a bruise that hadn't yet fully formed. She found herself replaying his words, wondering what it was about her that had triggered such immediate disdain. Was it her uniform, the simple black pants and white shirt that she washed and ironed every night? Was it something in her face, some sign of the struggles she tried so hard to hide? Or was it simply that she could smell desperation on her, the way predators scent wounded prey? By the time her shift ended at 2 o'clock, Maya had served 43 customers, walked approximately 6 miles back and forth across the diner's worn floor, and smiled until her cheeks ached. She hung up her apron in the small employee break room, a cramped space smelled of industrial disinfectant and the dreams deferred by people who had never planned to stay in food service but found themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The cufflink felt heavier in her pocket as she walked to her car, a 15-year-old Honda Civic with 180,000 miles and a passenger door that required a specific combination of pulling and praying to open. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, the afternoon sun streaming through the windshield, and allowed herself 30 seconds of the luxury she couldn't usually afford, self-pity. She thought about the business degree she'd never finished, abandoned when Emma arrived 3 months earlier than expected, and David decided that fatherhood wasn't the adventure he'd signed up for. She thought about the teaching position she'd dreamed of, standing in front of a classroom full of eager faces, shaping young minds and making a difference in the world. She thought about the house they'd planned to buy, with a yard big enough for Emma to play in and a kitchen where Maya could cook real meals instead of relying on whatever could be prepared quickly in their small apartment's cramped galley. 30 seconds. Then she turned the key, said a small prayer to whatever deity watched over aging cars and single mothers, and drove home to pick up Emma from the after-school program at the community center. Emma was waiting on the front steps when Maya pulled up, her backpack nearly as big as she was, her face lit up with the kind of joy that only 8-year-olds could achieve over something as simple as seeing their mother after a long day apart. She had David's dark hair, but Maya's brown eyes, and a smile that could make even the hardest day feel manageable. "Mom!" Emma called, running to the car with the enthusiasm of a puppy. "Guess what? Mrs. Peterson said my math test was the best in the class, and Jordan shared his pudding cup with me at lunch, and we're reading this really cool book about a girl who finds a secret door in her house, and there's a whole other world behind it." Maya felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly as Emma climbed into the passenger seat, still chattering about her day. This was what mattered. Not the cruel words of strangers, not the weight of bills that came faster than paychecks, not the dreams that had been set aside for survival. Emma's happiness, her sense of security, her belief that the world was fundamentally a good place, these were the treasures Maya guarded more fiercely than any parent had ever protected gold. "That sounds amazing, sweetheart," Maya said, pulling away from the curb. "Tell me more about this book." As Emma launched into an elaborate description of magical doorways and parallel worlds, Maya found herself thinking about the cufflink again. Such a small thing, really, but it represented something larger. The casual wealth of people who could afford to lose something valuable and never notice it was gone. The thoughtless cruelty of those who had never known what it meant to count pennies or choose between groceries and medicine. She had no idea that this small silver object would soon turn her carefully ordered world upside down, or that the man who had left it behind was about to discover that the consequences of cruelty could be far more complex than either of them had ever imagined. Maya's alarm went off at 4:47 a.m., 3 minutes before she would have woken up naturally. After 3 years of opening shifts at Sunrise Diner, her body had developed its own internal clock, one that never allowed for the luxury of sleeping in on her rare days off. She lay in the narrow single bed for exactly 30 seconds, allowing herself that brief moment between dreams and reality where anything still seemed possible, then swung her feet onto the cold linoleum floor of their small apartment. The apartment above Rodriguez Auto Repair wasn't much. 2 bedrooms barely larger than walk-in closets, a kitchen that required careful choreography to avoid collision, and a living room where the couch served as dining table, homework desk, and entertainment center depending on the hour. But it was theirs, and more importantly, it was safe. Miguel Rodriguez, the garage owner, had known Maya since high school and offered her the space for half the market rate when Emma was 6 and Maya was still reeling from David's departure. "Family helps family," he'd said in his gruff way, "and you've been like a daughter to me since you were dating my nephew, Carlos." Maya moved through her morning routine with the efficiency born of necessity. Shower in under 5 minutes using the generic shampoo she bought in bulk from the discount store. Hair pulled back in a ponytail that would stay neat through an 8-hour shift. Minimal makeup, just enough to look professional, not enough to waste precious minutes or money. The face that looked back at her from the bathroom mirror was 29 years old, but carried the weight of experiences that belonged to someone a decade older. She checked on Emma, who slept with the profound stillness of childhood, one arm wrapped around a stuffed elephant named Mr. Peanuts, who had been her constant companion since she was 3. Emma's room was a study in creative organization. Toys sorted into clear plastic bins, books arranged on shelves made from boards and concrete blocks, artwork covering every available inch of wall space. Maya had learned to be resourceful in ways she'd never imagined, turning constraints into creativity and limitations into opportunities for ingenuity. The morning routine continued. Coffee made from yesterday's grounds stretched with fresh ones, a quick review of the bills stacked on the kitchen counter, 15 minutes spent at the small desk in the corner working on her online accounting classes. Maya had been chipping away at her degree for 2 years now, taking one class per semester, all she could afford both financially and in terms of time. At this rate, she'd graduate when Emma was in high school, but Maya had learned to measure progress in small increments rather than grand gestures. She kissed Emma's forehead before leaving, a ritual that had started when Emma was a baby and continued now as a talisman against all the things that could go wrong in a world that seemed designed to test the limits of single mothers. Emma stirred slightly, murmured something about unicorns, and settled deeper into sleep. The drive to work took 12 minutes on a good day, 15 when the single traffic light in Cedar Falls malfunctioned, which happened with depressing regularity. Maya used the time to prepare mentally for the day ahead, running through the specials Carlos would have prepared, reviewing the reservations, what few there were, and steeling herself for whatever combination of kindness and cruelty the day might bring. Sunrise Diner sat at the intersection of Highway 34 and County Road 18, a position that at once made it a strategic stop for travelers, but now left it caught between the bypass that funneled traffic around town and the strip mall that offered faster, cheaper alternatives. The building itself had been constructed in the 1950s, back when diners were designed to look like railroad cars and chrome was considered the height of sophistication. 67 years later, the chrome had faded to a dull silver, the red vinyl booths bore the scars of thousands of meals, and the black and white checkered floor had developed a permanent film that no amount of mopping could eliminate. But there was something honest about the place, something that spoke to the dignity of simple work done well. The coffee was strong, the eggs were fresh from Henderson's farm 5 miles outside town, and the pie was made from scratch by Dolores Martinez, who had been supplying the diner with desserts for 15 years. Maya had come to love the ritual of opening, unlocking the front door, switching on the neon sign that buzzed "Open" in pink cursive letters, filling the coffee urns and setting up the cash register for another day of small transactions and smaller conversations. Carlos Mendoza, the cook, not to be confused with the Carlos who loved Emma like his own daughter, was already at work when Maya arrived, his broad back hunched over the grill as he prepared for the morning rush. Carlos was 53, had worked in restaurant kitchens since he was 16, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to cook 6 different orders simultaneously while never breaking a sweat. He lived alone in a trailer park on the outskirts of town, sent money to his mother in Mexico every month, and treated Maya with the protective gentleness of an older brother. "Morning, mija," he called without turning around. "Coffee's fresh, and I made those blueberry muffins Emma likes. Tell her to save room for one after school." This was Carlos's way. Gestures of kindness delivered so casually they seemed like afterthoughts, though Maya had learned to recognize them as carefully considered acts of love. The muffins would appear without charge on Maya's timesheet, just as the occasional sandwich or soup always seemed to be extras that would otherwise go to waste. The morning rush began at 6 sharp with the arrival of the highway patrol officers who stopped by every Tuesday for coffee and gossip. Then came the truckers, men and women who knew the quality of every diner within a 300-mile radius and had earned the right to be particular about their eggs. The construction crew from the County Road project arrived at 7, followed by the farmers who had finished their morning chores and were ready for second breakfast. Maya moved through it all with practiced grace, balancing plates, refilling coffee cups, and maintaining the delicate alchemy of professional friendliness that kept customers satisfied without encouraging unwanted personal attention. She knew Harold Peterson liked his pancakes with butter on the side and his coffee refilled exactly twice. She knew that Betty Johnson always ordered egg whites, but would share regular eggs if Maya suggested they were particularly fresh that day. She knew that the truckers appreciated efficiency above all else, while the farmers wanted conversation along with their meals. These relationships, built one interaction at a time over years of consistent service, were what made the job bearable on days when her feet ached and her smile felt painted on. Maya had learned that respect was earned through competence, that dignity could be maintained even when wearing an apron, and that there was honor in work that fed people and offered them a moment of comfort in their busy lives. But she had also learned that not everyone shared this perspective. The cufflink sat in her jewelry box at home, wrapped in tissue paper like a guilty secret. 3 days had passed since the incident with the rude customer, and Maya had not yet decided what to do with it. Emma's field trip was tomorrow, and the $20 Maya needed was still $20 she didn't have. The rational part of her mind argued that the man had forfeited any claim to courtesy when he'd chosen to be deliberately cruel. The cufflink was valuable, and valuable things left behind became the property of whoever found them. This was how the world worked, a system of small compensations for larger inequities. But another part of her, the part that had been shaped by her mother's quiet teachings about right and wrong, whispered that keeping it would make her complicit in something she couldn't quite name. It would change her from victim to participant, would blur the clear moral lines that had always guided her decisions. Maria had cleaned houses for wealthy families in the suburbs of Des Moines, had come home every evening with stories of casual waste and thoughtless privilege, but she had never allowed bitterness to root in her heart. The way people treat you says everything about them and nothing about you, she had told Maya. But the way you respond, that shows who you really are. Maria had died when Maya was 23, just 2 months before Emma was born, and Maya sometimes wondered what advice her mother would have given about navigating single parenthood, financial stress, and the daily challenge of maintaining dignity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. The lunch rush was lighter than the morning crowd, but more varied. Office workers from the courthouse, shoppers taking a break from errands, and the occasional family with children who kept Maya entertained with their questions about everything from why coffee was brown to whether the pie was made by real people or machines. Emma had asked similar questions when she was younger, and Maya found herself storing up these interactions to share with her daughter later, small gifts of humor to brighten their evening conversations. It was during this lull between lunch and dinner that Harold Peterson approached the counter with a folded newspaper in his hand and an expression Maya had learned to associate with bad news. "Maya," he said quietly, "you might want to see this." The newspaper was the Cedar Falls Gazette, and the headline on the front page made Maya's breath catch. "Local Development Company under investigation for housing discrimination." The article was brief but detailed enough to paint a clear picture of systematic practices designed to exclude low-income tenants, predatory lending schemes that targeted single mothers, and a pattern of behavior that had apparently been ongoing for years. The company was Hartwell Development, and the CEO identified in the accompanying photograph was unmistakably the man who had berated Maya 3 days ago. Richard Hartwell, age 57, with the same cold eyes and perfectly styled silver hair that had haunted Maya's memory.
"That's him," she whispered, her finger tracing the outline of his face in the grainy newspaper photo. "That's the man who was here Tuesday morning." Harold nodded grimly. "I thought it might be. The timing fits. And you mentioned he had out-of-state plates. Company's based in Chicago, specializes in buying up low-income housing and either converting it to luxury units or finding ways to force out tenants who can't afford increased rents." Maya stared at the article, reading details about families displaced, communities destroyed, and profits built on the systematic exploitation of people who had no power to fight back. Richard Hartwell had built his fortune on other people's desperation, had made cruelty into a business model, and had apparently been doing it for years with complete impunity. "There's more," Harold said gently. "The investigation includes his business practices here in Iowa. Apparently he's been buying properties in small towns, letting them deteriorate, then claiming the need for expensive renovations as justification for rent increases that force out long-term tenants." The implications hit Maya like a physical blow. How many families had been displaced by this man's greed? How many children had been forced to change schools, leave friends, abandon the only homes they'd ever known? How many single mothers like herself had found themselves suddenly homeless, their carefully constructed lives shattered by someone who viewed their suffering as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of profit? She thought about the cufflink again, and its meaning shifted in her mind. It wasn't just a piece of expensive jewelry now. It was an evidence of Richard Hartwell's presence at the diner, physical proof that he had been there on the day the article mentioned he was in town for property acquisitions. "Harold," Maya said slowly, "what would happen if someone could prove that a person like this was in town on specific dates? Would that be important for an investigation?" The retired lawyer looked at her with sharp attention. "It could be very important, depending on what properties were involved and what happened on those dates. Why do you ask?" Maya reached into her apron pocket and withdrew the cufflink, unwrapping it carefully from the tissue paper she'd wrapped it in that morning. The silver caught the afternoon light streaming through the diner's windows, and the engraved initials RH seemed to gleam with sudden significance. "Because I think I found something that belongs to Mr. Hartwell, and I think it's time to return it." The Cedar Falls police station occupied a modest brick building on Main Street, sandwiched between Paulson's hardware store and the library that had been Maya's refuge during her teenage years. Maya had never been inside the police station before, and she found herself surprised by how ordinary it looked. Fluorescent lights that hummed slightly, industrial carpeting in an uninspiring shade of gray, and the faint smell of coffee that had been brewing too long. Detective Sarah Chen was younger than Maya had expected, probably close to her own age, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested she had heard every possible human story and found ways to maintain both skepticism and compassion. She examined the cufflink through a clear evidence bag, turning it over carefully while Maya recounted the events of Tuesday morning. "You're certain this is the same man from the newspaper photo?" Detective Chen asked for the third time, her pen poised over a legal pad covered with neat handwriting. "Absolutely certain," Maya replied. "The suit, the car, the attitude, everything matches. And those initials, RH, it can't be a coincidence." Detective Chen nodded, making another note. "The timing is significant. According to our information, Hartwell was in Cedar Falls on Tuesday to finalize the purchase of the Riverside
Apartments complex, 24 units, mostly occupied by elderly residents and single-parent families." Maya felt a chill of recognition. The Riverside Apartments were where Emma's best friend Chloe lived with her grandmother, a retired teacher named Mrs. Patterson, who survived on Social Security and a small pension. Chloe had mentioned that there were new owners, that rent was going up, but Maya hadn't connected it to anything larger than the usual difficulties of affordable housing. "What will happen to the residents?" Maya asked. "That's what we're trying to prevent," Detective Chen said. "The federal investigation into Hartwell development has uncovered a pattern of what they call predatory displacement. They buy properties with stable, long-term tenants, then create conditions that force those tenants out. Sudden rent increases, selective enforcement of lease violations, manufactured maintenance emergencies that make units temporarily uninhabitable." The detective pulled out a file folder thick with documents and photographs. In Chicago, they displaced over 200 families in the past 3 years. In Indianapolis, they turned affordable housing into luxury condos, forcing elderly residents to choose between homelessness and moving hundreds of miles away from their support systems. Maya stared at the photographs Detective Chen showed her. Families loading belongings into pickup trucks. elderly people sitting on park benches surrounded by suitcases. Children holding cardboard signs explaining that they needed homes. Each image represented someone's life disrupted, someone's security shattered for the sake of Richard Hartwell's profit margins. "But you can stop him here?" Maya asked. "We're trying. The federal investigators have been building a case, but they need evidence of specific illegal practices. Your cufflink proves Hartwell was in town on the day the purchase was finalized, which helps establish timeline. But what we really need is evidence of discriminatory practices, documented proof of the tactics they used to force out tenants." Detective Chen closed the file and looked directly at Maya. "I want you to understand something. Going forward with this means becoming part of a federal investigation. There will be interviews, possibly testimony, certainly scrutiny of your own life and background. These are powerful people with expensive lawyers, and they won't hesitate to attack the credibility of witnesses." Maya thought about Emma, about the careful life they had built, about the risks that came with drawing attention from powerful enemies. She thought about Mrs. Patterson and Chloe, about the other families at Riverside Apartments who probably had no idea what was coming. She thought about all the people in other cities who had lost their homes to Richard Hartwell's greed, and all the people in future cities who would lose theirs if no one stood up to him. "What do I need to do?" she asked. The next 3 weeks transformed Maya's understanding of both justice and injustice in ways she could never have anticipated. Working with Detective Chen and a team of federal investigators, she learned that Richard Hartwell's business model was far more sophisticated and cruel than she had initially imagined. The investigators had been tracking Hartwell development for 18 months, following a pattern that played out across the Midwest with depressing consistency. First, the company would identify properties in small towns where housing options were limited and local government oversight was minimal. They would purchase properties with stable long-term tenants, usually elderly people or single parents who had few alternatives and limited resources to fight back. Phase 2 involved what the investigators called manufactured deterioration. "The beauty of it, from their perspective," explained FBI agent Martinez during one of the briefings Maya attended, "is that it's all technically legal. They're not violating housing law directly, just creating conditions that make tenants want to leave voluntarily." Maya spent her evenings after work, at her days off, meeting with investigators, reviewing documents, and learning about the lives that had been disrupted by Richard Hartwell's business practices. She met a woman named Jennifer Lopez, who had been forced to move her 2 children 4 times in 3 years, as Hartwell Development systematically acquired and improved the only affordable housing in her Illinois town. She spoke with Robert Chen, no relation to Detective Chen, a 78-year-old widower who had lost his apartment of 15 years when Hartwell claimed that his collection of woodworking tools constituted a fire hazard that voided his lease. Each story built on the others, creating a picture of systematic cruelty that made Maya's encounter at the diner seem almost trivial by comparison. Richard Hartwell's contempt for her had been personal and immediate, but his contempt for entire communities was institutional and devastating. The investigation also revealed the economic logic behind Hartwell's behavior. By forcing out long-term tenants who paid below-market rents, he could renovate properties minimally and re-rent them at prices that were technically still affordable according to federal guidelines, but were beyond the reach of the previous tenants. The properties generated higher revenues, the displaced families became someone else's problem, and Richard Hartwell's profit margins improved quarter by quarter. "It's genius in its way," Detective Chen admitted during one of their conversations. "He's found a way to make displacement profitable while staying within the technical bounds of the law." But the investigation was also uncovering evidence that Hartwell Development had crossed those bounds in several instances. There were documented cases of intimidation, including private investigators sent to photograph tenants' daily activities and security guards hired to patrol properties with instructions to make residents feel unwelcome. There were forged documents, falsified maintenance reports, and what appeared to be coordination with local officials to expedite eviction proceedings. Most significantly for Maya's situation, there was evidence that the Riverside Apartments purchase in Cedar Falls was part of a larger pattern of targeting properties with specific demographic profiles: elderly residents, single mothers, families with disabled members who might have difficulty relocating. Your encounter with Hartwell at the diner fits perfectly with the psychological profile our experts have developed, explained Agent Martinez. He sees certain types of people as obstacles to his business model, and he responds to them with instinctive hostility. The fact that he was so casually cruel to you suggests that he views service workers, single mothers, and working-class people in general as fundamentally inferior. Maya found herself thinking about this conversation as she went through her daily routine at the diner. She looked at her customers differently now, not just as individuals with specific breakfast preferences, but as representatives of entire communities that were under systematic attack by people like Richard Hartwell. Harold Peterson, with his modest pension and fixed income, represented the elderly tenants being displaced. Betty Johnson, who worked 2 part-time jobs to supplement her disability payments, represented the vulnerable populations being targeted. The truckers and construction workers represented the blue-collar communities being priced out of their own neighborhoods. The personal stakes of the investigation became clear during Maya's 4th week of involvement. Detective Chen called her at home on a Thursday evening, her usually calm voice tight with urgency. "Maya, we need to talk. Can you come to the station tonight?" Maya found Emma a babysitter and drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, her mind racing through possibilities. When she arrived at the police station, Detective Chen was waiting with a thick folder and a grim expression. "They know about you," she said without preamble. "Hartwell's lawyers have identified you as a potential witness, and they're already working to discredit your testimony."
The folder contained a disturbing collection of documents: Maya's employment records from the diner, her credit report, her rental history, and even Emma's school records. There were photographs taken with a telephoto lens showing Maya leaving work, picking up Emma from the community center, and shopping at the grocery store. Most unsettling of all, there was a summary report that detailed every aspect of Maya's financial situation, her relationship history, and what the investigators called lifestyle choices that could affect credibility. "They're building a case that you're an unreliable witness with a history of poor judgment and financial instability," Detective Chen explained. "They're going to argue that you have ulterior motives for testifying, that you're seeking attention or financial compensation, that your memory of events is compromised by personal animosity toward their client." Maya stared at the documents, feeling exposed and violated in ways she hadn't experienced since David's departure. These strangers had dissected her life with the cold efficiency of forensic accountants, reducing her struggles and sacrifices to bullet points that could be used to attack her character. "Is any of it true?" she asked quietly. "None of it matters," Detective Chen replied. "You're a working mother doing her best under difficult circumstances. You've never been arrested, never been in legal trouble, never given anyone reason to question your honesty or integrity. But they're going to try to make your poverty and your status as a single mother seem like character flaws that disqualify you as a witness." The investigator leaned forward, her expression intense. "Maya, I want you to understand what you're up against. These people have resources we can barely imagine. They've hired private investigators, retained teams of lawyers, and they're prepared to spend whatever it takes to protect their business model. They see you as a threat not just to this one case, but to their entire operation." Maya felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "So they think they can intimidate me because I'm poor, because I work as a waitress, because I'm raising a daughter alone?" "That's exactly what they think," Detective Chen confirmed. "And in many cases, they're right. Most people in your situation can't afford to fight back, can't risk having their lives scrutinized, can't take time off work for depositions and court appearances. The system is designed to protect people like Richard Hartwell and silence people like you. But Maya was thinking about Emma, about the field trip she had finally been able to afford thanks to an extra shift Carlos had arranged for her. She was thinking about Mrs. Patterson and Chloe, about all the families at Riverside Apartments who were about to lose their homes. She was thinking about her mother's voice, about character and choice, about the difference between being a victim and being a participant. What do they want from me? Right now, they're probably hoping that knowing about the investigation will be enough to make you back down. If that doesn't work, they'll try to pressure you through your employer, your landlord, maybe even Emma's school. They want you to disappear, to decide that cooperation isn't worth the trouble. Detective Chen opened another folder, this one containing what appeared to be a legal document. They've also made an offer. $50,000, paid into an account of your choosing, in exchange for a signed statement saying that you can't be certain of the identity of the customer at the diner, that your memory of the incident may have been influenced by subsequent media coverage, and that you no longer wish to be involved in any investigation. $50,000. The number seemed impossible, surreal. It was more money than Maya had ever imagined having at one time. It would pay off her debts, cover Emma's college fund, maybe even allow her to finish her degree without working double shifts. It would solve in a single signature every financial problem that kept her awake at night, calculating and recalculating the monthly budget. "And if I don't take it?" she asked. "Then this gets much harder for everyone involved. They'll fight the investigation every step of the way, and they'll make your life as difficult as legally possible while doing it." Maya thought about Richard Hartwell's face as he had dismissed her at the diner, the casual cruelty in his voice when he called her a welfare case playing dress-up. She thought about the families in the photographs Agent Martinez had shown her, the children holding signs asking for homes. She thought about the systematic, institutional cruelty that had made Richard Hartwell wealthy and left countless families displaced and desperate. "Detective Chen," she said finally, "what happens to the people at Riverside Apartments if this investigation fails?" "They lose their homes, probably within 6 months, based on Hartwell's pattern in other cities. The rent increases have already started, and we've documented 3 families who've already been forced to move because they couldn't afford the new rates." Maya nodded slowly. "And if the investigation succeeds?" "If we can prove a pattern of discriminatory practices, we can get court orders preventing the displacement of current tenants. We can force them to sell the properties to local housing authorities or nonprofit organizations. We can make sure this doesn't happen again, here or anywhere else." The choice, when Maya finally understood it fully, wasn't really about money or personal safety. It was about the kind of world she wanted Emma to grow up in, the kind of person she wanted Emma to become. It was about whether cruelty and greed would continue to be rewarded with impunity, or whether ordinary people could still stand up to extraordinary power and win. "I need to call my babysitter," Maya said. "This is going to take longer than I thought." The next phase of the investigation required Maya to become someone she had never imagined being, an undercover witness. Working with federal agents, she was fitted with recording equipment and given training on how to document interactions without arousing suspicion. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Maya would continue working at the diner, but now she would be watching and listening for any representative of Hartwell Development who might visit Cedar Falls to implement the next phase of their plan. The recording equipment was smaller than she had expected, barely larger than a button and designed to look like a small piece of jewelry. Agent Martinez spent an entire afternoon teaching Maya how to activate it discreetly, how to position herself for optimal audio quality, and how to ask questions that would encourage people to reveal more than they intended. "The key," he explained, "is to seem like exactly what you are,
a local waitress who hears gossip and is curious about what's happening in town. People like Hartwell's employees often talk freely around service workers because they don't consider them real people, just part of the scenery. Maya found this assessment depressingly accurate over the following weeks. The diner became a stage where she performed a version of herself, asking casual questions about new people in town, expressing concern about changes at Riverside, and encouraging customers to share what they knew about the new property management company. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday morning in early April. Maya was refilling coffee cups during the breakfast rush when two men in expensive suits entered the diner, shaking rain from their umbrellas and speaking in the kind of low, urgent voices that suggested important business. They chose a corner booth, the same booth where Richard Hartwell had sat 6 weeks earlier, and Maya felt her pulse quicken as she activated the recording device. The men were younger than Hartwell, probably in their 30s, with the kind of confident bearing that came from never having been told no about anything that mattered.
"That's why we use the standard progression," the first man said, adding cream to his coffee. "Start with reasonable rent increases, then begin the maintenance complaints. Most of them will leave voluntarily once they understand the situation has changed." Maya continued her rounds, refilling cups and taking orders, but her attention remained focused on the corner booth. The men were discussing Riverside Apartments in detail, mentioning specific units and the demographics of current tenants. They talked about Mrs. Patterson and her hoarding problem, a reference to her collection of teaching supplies that she kept hoping to donate to schools. They discussed the young mother in Unit 12 who would probably move once she realizes the neighborhood is changing. They mentioned the disabled veteran in Unit 18 whose modified kitchen would be expensive to restore to standard configuration. "The beauty of this location," the second man continued, "is that there really aren't alternative housing options. Once we clear out the current tenants, we can renovate at minimal cost and market the units to commuters from Cedar Rapids. The rent differential will be substantial." Maya felt sick listening to them discuss her neighbors like obstacles to be removed, but she forced herself to maintain her professional demeanor. When she brought their Eggs Benedict, which Carlos had prepared with obvious reluctance, she lingered just long enough to catch the first man's next comment. "Hartwell was right about this town. The local government is completely passive, there's no organized tenant advocacy, and the economic profile is perfect for our model. We should be able to replicate this approach in 5 or 6 similar markets over the next 2 years." The recording device captured everything: names, dates, specific strategies, and most damning of all, explicit acknowledgement that Hartwell Development targeted communities specifically because they lacked the resources to fight back. When Maya finally transmitted the recording to Agent Martinez that evening, his excitement was immediately apparent. "This is exactly what we needed. They've described textbook discriminatory practices, admitted to targeting vulnerable populations, and provided evidence of a coordinated plan to displace tenants based on economic status and disability. Combined with the documentation from other cities, this gives us everything we need for federal charges." But Maya's role in the investigation was far from over. The federal team needed more evidence, particularly documentation of the specific tactics being used at Riverside Apartments. This required Maya to do something that felt like crossing a line from witness to active participant. She would need to visit the apartments, talk to residents, and encourage them to document the problems they were experiencing. Maya had never thought of herself as an investigator, but she discovered that her background as a waitress had prepared her for this role in unexpected ways. She knew how to listen to people, how to ask questions that drew out information, and how to make others feel comfortable sharing their concerns. Most importantly, she understood the particular vulnerabilities of working-class people and single parents because she lived those vulnerabilities every day. Her first visit was to Mrs. Patterson, who welcomed Maya and Emma for an afternoon of tea and cookies that turned into a 4-hour conversation about the changes happening at Riverside Apartments. Mrs. Patterson had been documenting problems with meticulous care, a habit developed during 40 years of teaching,
and her records painted a clear picture of systematic harassment. "It started small," she explained, showing Maya a notebook filled with dates and details. "The elevator broke down and took 3 weeks to repair, which was hard on the residents with mobility issues. Then the laundry room was temporarily closed for 2 months. The security lights in the parking lot burned out and weren't replaced." Maya looked through the notebook, seeing patterns that Mrs. Patterson might not have recognized, but that were obvious to someone who now understood Hartwell Development's methods. "Did they give you explanations for these problems?" "Oh yes, always very reasonable explanations. Budget constraints, supply chain issues, scheduling conflicts with repair contractors. But somehow the problems kept getting worse instead of better." Emma was playing with Chloe in the next room, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the serious conversation. Maya watched them through the doorway and thought about how many children's friendships had been shattered by Richard Hartwell's business model, how many families had been forced to start over in new communities where they knew no one and had no support systems. "Mrs. Patterson," Maya said carefully, "would you be willing to share this documentation with some people who might be able to help?" The elderly woman looked at her sharply. "What kind of people?" Maya explained about the investigation, about her role as a witness, about the federal agents who were building a case against Hartwell Development. She watched Mrs. Patterson's expression change from surprise to understanding to something that might have been relief. "You mean we're not alone in this?" Mrs. Patterson said. "Other people in other places have gone through the same thing. Many other people, and some of them fought back successfully." Mrs. Patterson closed her notebook and held it against her chest like a shield. "I've been teaching for 40 years, she said. "I've seen bullies in every form imaginable. The only thing that stops them is when someone stands up to them." Word spread through Riverside apartments with the speed that news travels in small communities where people look out for each other. Within a week, Maya had documentation from 16 different units, maintenance requests that were ignored, lease violations that were selectively enforced, rent increases that seemed designed to force out specific tenants. The pattern was clear, methodical, and exactly what the federal investigators needed to prove their case. But Hartwell Development was also adapting to the resistance. The 2 men Maya had recorded returned to Cedar Falls with a team of lawyers and private investigators. They filed complaints with the health department about unsanitary conditions at the apartments, initiated eviction proceedings against 3 tenants for minor lease violations, and began what Agent Martinez called economic pressure campaigns, designed to make life difficult for anyone who might be cooperating with the investigation. Maya discovered what this meant when she arrived at work one morning to find Carlos looking worried and uncomfortable. "Carlos," he said, "we need to talk." They sat in the small break room behind the kitchen, surrounded by the familiar smells of coffee and bacon grease, while Carlos explained that representatives from Hartwell Development had visited the diner's owner the previous evening. "They didn't threaten anybody directly," Carlos said, "but they asked a lot of questions about you, about your work schedule, about whether you had access to customer information. They suggested that the diner might want to review its employee policies regarding participation in legal proceedings." Maya felt a chill of recognition. This was exactly the kind of pressure Detective Chen had warned her about. Not illegal, not directly threatening, but designed to make her employer nervous about keeping her on staff. "Did they say anything else?" she asked. "They mentioned that they were considering the diner as a location for business meetings, that they might become regular customers if the environment was appropriate. But they also suggested that negative publicity from employee involvement in frivolous investigations might affect their decision." Maya understood the implicit threat. If she continued cooperating with the investigation, Hartwell Development would find ways to harm the diner's business. If she backed down, they might become regular customers, bringing revenue that a struggling restaurant could not afford to lose. "Carlos," Maya said, "what did the owner say?" He told them that employee activities outside of work were none of his business, and that the diner served everyone who behaved respectfully regardless of their politics or legal troubles. Carlos smiled grimly. Then he suggested they might want to try the new chain restaurant by the highway if they needed a more corporate dining experience. Maya felt a surge of gratitude for the quiet support of people who understood that some things mattered more than money. But she also understood that her decision to cooperate with the investigation was affecting more than just her own life. Other people were being forced to choose sides, to take risks, to sacrifice their own security for the sake of justice that might never come. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. The courtroom in the federal building in Cedar Rapids was smaller than Maya had imagined, more like an oversized conference room than the dramatic space she had seen in movies. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the polished wooden tables where teams of lawyers arranged stacks of documents with the precision of military strategists. Maya sat in the witness section, her hands folded carefully in her lap, wearing the one professional outfit she owned, a navy blue dress she had bought at a consignment shop for Emma's school graduation ceremony. 6 months had passed since that morning when Richard Hartwell had left his cufflink on the diner floor. 6 months that had transformed Maya from an invisible waitress into a key witness in a federal case that had attracted national attention. The investigation had expanded beyond Hartwell Development to include 3 other companies using similar tactics, and the evidence gathered had revealed a network of systematic displacement that affected thousands of families across 8 states. Maya's testimony was scheduled for the second day of hearings, but she had been in the courtroom since the proceedings began, listening to expert witnesses explain the economics of displacement, sociologists described the psychological impact on displaced families, and federal agents detailed the evidence they had gathered. The picture that emerged was both larger and more devastating than anything Maya had initially imagined. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a housing policy expert from the University of Iowa, had spent an entire morning explaining how companies like Hartwell Development exploited gaps in federal housing law to target vulnerable populations. The strategy is sophisticated because it operates within the technical boundaries of legal behavior while producing outcomes that are fundamentally discriminatory, she testified. By focusing on properties with elderly tenants, disabled residents, and single-parent families, these companies are essentially conducting ethnic and economic cleansing under the guise of market-driven improvement. Maya had listened to this testimony with a mixture of anger and recognition. The academic language couldn't capture the human cost. The look on Mrs. Patterson's face when she described having to choose between medications and rent. The way Chloe had cried when she thought she might have to change schools. The quiet desperation of parents who worked multiple jobs but still couldn't afford the improved housing their children needed. Robert Chen, the elderly widower who had lost his apartment in Indianapolis, testified about the specific tactics used against older residents. They told me my woodworking tools were a fire hazard, that my collection of books violated occupancy standards, that my late wife's garden on the balcony constituted property damage. Each complaint came with fees, deadlines, requirements that seemed designed to be impossible to meet. Maya had found herself thinking about her mother during Robert's testimony, about the collection of teaching supplies Mrs. Patterson kept in her apartment, about all the ways that people's lives could be redefined as problems to be solved through displacement. The defense strategy became clear as Hartwell Development's lawyers began their presentation. They argued that their client was simply responding to market forces, that property improvements and rent adjustments were standard business practices, that tenant displacement was an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of economic development. They presented Richard Hartwell as a successful businessman who had created jobs and revitalized communities, whose methods might be aggressive but were entirely legal. Mr. Hartwell has never violated housing law, his lead attorney argued. He has never discriminated based on protected characteristics. He has never used illegal tactics to force tenant relocation.
What the prosecution is calling systematic displacement is actually market-driven improvement that benefits entire communities by upgrading substandard housing and attracting new residents with higher incomes. Maya listened to this defense with growing outrage. The lawyers spoke about market forces and economic development as if these were natural phenomena rather than choices made by people who had the power to choose differently. They described Richard Hartwell's wealth as evidence of his success rather than evidence of other people's suffering. When Maya's turn finally came to testify, she felt the weight of all the stories she had heard, all the documentation she had gathered, all the families whose lives hung in the balance of this proceeding. The prosecutor, a woman named Rebecca Walsh, who had spent 15 years specializing in housing discrimination cases, guided Maya through her testimony with careful precision. Ms. Rodriguez, please describe your interaction with the defendant on the morning of March 15th. Maya took a breath and began to recount the story that had started everything. The broken coffee mug, the casual cruelty, the cufflink left behind like a signature on someone else's humiliation. As she spoke, she could see Richard Hartwell at the defense table, wearing another expensive suit, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes holding the same cold assessment she remembered from the diner. The defendant made several comments about your competence and employment status, Ms. Walsh continued. Can you repeat his exact words? Maya repeated Richard Hartwell's comments word for word, each phrase preserved in her memory with painful clarity. She watched the jury's faces as she described being called a welfare case playing dress-up, saw their expressions shift from sympathy to something harder and more determined. How did these comments make you feel? The prosecutor asked. Objection, called Hartwell's lawyer. The witness's feelings are not relevant to the legal questions before this court. Overruled, the judge replied. The witness may answer. Maya considered the question carefully. How had it made her feel? Angry, certainly. Humiliated, without question. But there had been something else, something that had taken her months to understand fully. It made me feel like I wasn't a real person to him. Like my life, my struggles, my daughter's needs, none of it mattered because I was poor. Like poverty was a character flaw that made me deserving of contempt. Ms. Walsh nodded. And when you learned about the defendant's business practices, how did that change your understanding of this interaction?
I realized it wasn't personal, Maya said. He didn't treat me that way because of anything I had done. He treated me that way because he sees people like me, working people, single parents, people without money, as obstacles to his profit. The cruelty wasn't an accident or a bad day. It was how he thinks about people who don't have power. The cross-examination was as brutal as Detective Chen had warned her it would be. Hartwell's lawyer, a man named Thomas Bradley, who wore suits that probably cost more than Maya made in a month, systematically attacked every aspect of her life and credibility. Ms. Rodriguez, you've been employed as a waitress for 3 years, is that correct? Yes. And before that, you were unemployed for approximately 18 months while receiving government assistance? I was caring for my newborn daughter and looking for work that would allow me to support her. But you were receiving welfare benefits during that time? I received assistance that I qualified for while I was between jobs, yes. Bradley continued this line of questioning for 20 minutes, establishing Maya's financial struggles, her incomplete education, her status as a single mother, her reliance on various forms of assistance over the years. Each question was designed to reinforce the narrative that she was an unreliable witness with ulterior motives for testifying. Ms. Rodriguez, when you found the defendant's cufflink, what was your initial intention? Maya had prepared for this question, but it still felt like stepping onto thin ice. I wasn't sure. I thought about trying to return it, but I was angry about how he had treated me. Did you consider keeping it? Yes, I did. For how long did you consider keeping it? Several days. And during those days, what prevented you from simply keeping the cufflink and selling it?
Maya looked directly at Richard Hartwell as she answered. My conscience. I was raised to believe that keeping something that doesn't belong to you makes you complicit in something wrong, even if the person who lost it had treated you badly. But you did consider profiting from the defendant's lost property? I considered it, yes. I needed money for my daughter's school trip, and I was angry. But ultimately, I decided that my character mattered more than my financial situation. Bradley pressed her on this point for several more minutes, clearly trying to establish that Maya's decision to turn in the cufflink was motivated by potential reward money or publicity rather than civic duty. But Maya had learned something important during her months of involvement in the investigation. Truth had a weight and consistency that lies could never match, and when you stayed close to the truth, it was almost impossible to become truly lost. The breakthrough moment came when Bradley made the mistake of challenging Maya's knowledge of Hartwell Development's business practices. Ms. Rodriguez, you're not an expert in housing policy or business law, are you? No, I'm not. You have no formal education in real estate or property management? No. So your opinions about the defendant's business practices are based entirely on hearsay and speculation? Maya felt the flash of the same anger that she had experienced that morning at the diner, but this time she channeled it into clarity rather than silence. Mr. Bradley, I may not have formal education in housing policy, but I have a PhD in being poor. I have years of experience in what it's like to choose between rent and groceries, to explain to your child why you have to move again, to smile politely while people who have never missed a meal tell you that your problems are your own fault. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Maya could see several jurors nodding slightly, their expressions suggesting that her words had hit home in ways that expert testimony might not. I can see what it looks like when someone with power decides that people without power don't deserve basic dignity. I know what it sounds like when cruelty gets dressed up as business policy. And I know the difference between market forces and systematic targeting of vulnerable people. Bradley tried to regain control of the examination, but Maya had found her voice in a way that couldn't be taken back. When he asked about her motives for testifying, she looked directly at the jury and spoke from her heart. I'm testifying because I want my daughter to grow up in a world where being poor doesn't make you a target, where working hard matters more than having money, where people can't destroy entire communities just because they have the resources to hire lawyers and investigators.
Paused, looking at Richard Hartwell again. I'm testifying because someone needs to speak for all the families who have been displaced, all the children who have had to start over, all the elderly people who have lost their homes. I'm testifying because silence in the face of systematic cruelty makes you complicit in that cruelty. The judge called for a recess, and Maya walked out of the courtroom feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. Detective Chan met her in the hallway, her expression suggesting cautious optimism. How do you think it went? Maya asked. I think you did something very important in there, Detective Chen. You made it personal without making it emotional. You showed them that this isn't about abstract policy questions. It's about real people with real lives who deserve to be treated with basic human dignity. But the most significant revelation was yet to come. That evening, as Maya sat in her hotel room preparing for the next day's proceedings, Agent Martinez called with news that would transform the entire case. Maya, we've had a breakthrough. One of Hartwell's employees has decided to cooperate with the investigation. He's provided us with internal documents that show the systematic nature of their targeting even more clearly than we had hoped. The employee was Thomas Morrison, one of the men Maya had recorded at the diner. Faced with federal charges and evidence of his participation in discriminatory practices, he had agreed to provide testimony and documentation in exchange for reduced charges. What kind of documentation? Maya asked. Training materials, policy manuals, demographic analysis reports, everything we need to prove that Hartwell Development's practices weren't just aggressive business tactics, but deliberate targeting of protected populations. They have internal memos discussing the optimal tenant profiles for displacement,
strategies for avoiding fair housing violations while achieving discriminatory outcomes, and revenue projections based on systematic displacement of elderly and disabled residents. Maya thought about the two men in their expensive suits, discussing her neighbors like obstacles to be removed. The idea that their cruelty was not just personal but institutional, not just local but systematic, filled her with a rage that was oddly clarifying. "What does this mean for the case?" she asked. "It means we're no longer just prosecuting Richard Hartwell for discriminatory business practices. We're prosecuting him for conspiracy to violate federal housing law, for systematic targeting of protected populations, and for operating a criminal enterprise designed to profit from displacement of vulnerable communities." The next morning, Maya watched from the gallery as Thomas Morrison took the stand and dismantled any remaining pretense that Hartwell Development's practices were accidental or well-intentioned. He described training sessions where employees were taught to identify displacement-appropriate properties based on tenant demographics. He presented internal emails discussing the most effective methods for forcing out problematic residents. He revealed policy documents that explicitly described elderly, disabled, and single-parent tenants as revenue optimization opportunities. We had detailed protocols for each type of target tenant. For elderly residents, we would claim that their possessions violated fire safety codes. For disabled residents, we would argue that their accommodations created liability issues. For single mothers, we would enforce lease provisions that made normal family life a violation.
The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Maria Santos, a child psychologist who had studied the impact of housing displacement on families. Her testimony about the long-term effects on children, academic disruption, social isolation, anxiety disorders, developmental delays, provided the emotional context that connected abstract legal violations to concrete human suffering. Children who experience multiple displacements show patterns similar to those seen in refugees from war zones, Dr. Santos explained. The trauma of losing their homes, their schools, their support networks can affect their ability to form relationships, succeed academically, and develop healthy coping mechanisms for years afterward. Maya thought about Emma, about Chloe, about all the children whose lives had been disrupted by Richard Hartwell's pursuit of profit. She thought about the systematic nature of that disruption, the calculated cruelty that treated childhood trauma as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of higher quarterly earnings. When the prosecution rested its case, Maya felt both relief and anticipation. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was compelling, and the documentation was damning. But she had learned enough about the legal system to know that evidence and justice were not always the same thing, that wealthy defendants with expensive lawyers could sometimes escape consequences that would be inevitable for ordinary people. The defense's closing argument focused on the technical legality of Hartwell Development's practices, the complexity of housing markets, and the difficulty of proving discriminatory intent. Richard Hartwell's lawyer argued that his client was a successful businessman whose methods might be aggressive but were entirely within the bounds of law. But the prosecution's closing argument, delivered by Rebecca Walsh with quiet passion, focused on the systematic nature of the evidence, the consistency of patterns across multiple states, and the human cost of treating housing as a commodity rather than a human right. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Miss Walsh concluded, "this case is about more than Richard Hartwell and Hartwell Development. It's about whether we will allow the systematic displacement of vulnerable communities to continue under the guise of business as usual, or whether we will insist that even the pursuit of profit must be constrained by basic human dignity." As Maya left the courthouse that day, she realized that regardless of the jury's verdict, something fundamental had already changed. The stories had been told, the evidence had been presented, and the systematic nature of displacement had been exposed in ways that would make it impossible to ignore in the future.
The truth was finally out, and Maya had learned that sometimes speaking truth to power was its own form of victory.
Consequences. The fact that he was here, facing federal charges brought by a waitress he had dismissed as insignificant, seemed to have shaken something fundamental in his worldview. The judge entered and the courtroom rose as one. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to the cooperating witness, was a woman in her 60s with the kind of composed authority that suggested she had presided over every possible human drama and found ways to balance justice with mercy. She had been appointed to the federal bench 12 years earlier after a distinguished career as a prosecutor specializing in civil rights violations. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Morrison asked. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man who had worked as a high school principal before retirement, stood slowly. "We have, Your Honor." Maya felt her heart hammering as the foreman unfolded the paper that contained months of investigation, weeks of testimony, and the hopes of countless families who had been displaced by systematic greed. "On the charge of conspiracy to violate federal housing law, we find the defendant guilty." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the courtroom. Maya felt tears she hadn't expected burning at the corners of her eyes. "On the charge of systematic targeting of protected populations, we find the defendant guilty." Someone behind Maya was crying quietly. She turned to see Jennifer Lopez, the woman from Illinois, covering her face with her hands while her shoulders shook with relief. "On the charge of operating a criminal enterprise designed to profit from discriminatory practices, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. People were hugging, crying, calling out thanks to the jury. Maya sat in stunned silence, trying to process the reality that justice had actually been served, that the system had worked for people like her for once, that Richard Hartwell would face consequences for the systematic cruelty he had inflicted on vulnerable communities. Judge Morrison called for order, but her expression suggested she understood and even approved of the emotional response. When the courtroom finally quieted, Judge Morrison addressed Richard Hartwell directly. "Mr. Hartwell, you have been found guilty of serious federal crimes that have caused immeasurable harm to individuals, families, and entire communities. Your actions were not driven by legitimate business considerations, but by systematic targeting of people who lacked the resources to fight back. This court will not tolerate the exploitation of vulnerable populations under the guise of business as usual." The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, but the immediate impact of the verdict was profound and far-reaching. Within hours of the jury's decision, federal agents had seized Hartwell Development's assets and begun the process of transferring ownership of properties affected to local housing authorities and nonprofit organizations. The Riverside Apartments in Cedar Falls would be converted to affordable housing managed by the county with rent protections and tenant rights that would prevent future displacement.
Maya walked out of the courthouse into bright October sunlight, feeling as if the world had been fundamentally altered. Detective Chen found her on the courthouse steps, where she stood looking up at the sky with an expression of wonder. "How does it feel?" Detective Chen asked. Maya considered the question. How did it feel to watch systematic cruelty receive systematic justice? How did it feel to discover that ordinary people could still stand up to extraordinary power and win? How did it feel to know that her daughter would grow up in a world where speaking truth to power was not just possible, but effective? "It feels like the beginning of something," Maya said finally. "Not just the end of this case, but the beginning of something larger." She was right. The Hartwell case, as it came to be known in legal circles, established precedents that would be used to prosecute similar schemes across the country. The documentation gathered during the investigation became a template for identifying discriminatory practices, and Maya's testimony became a model for how ordinary citizens could effectively challenge systematic abuse.
But the most immediate change was in Cedar Falls itself. The story of a waitress who stood up to a billionaire developer had captured national attention, and the small town found itself at the center of conversations about housing justice, economic inequality, and the power of individual courage to create social change. Maya returned to work at the Sunrise Diner the Monday after the verdict, uncertain how her newfound notoriety would affect her daily routine. She needn't have worried. The breakfast rush proceeded as usual. Truckers ordered eggs over easy, farmers discussed weather patterns, and Harold Peterson read his newspaper while working through his stack of pancakes. But there was something different in the air, a sense of pride and possibility that Maya could feel in the way people looked at her, spoke to her, included her in their conversations. "You did something important," Dolores Martinez told her as Maya refilled her coffee cup. "You showed all of us that fighting back is possible." Carlos emerged from the kitchen with a plate of blueberry muffins, the ones Emma loved, and set them on the counter with a grin. "These are on the house," he said, "for the woman who brought down a billionaire with a cufflink and a conscience." The weeks following the verdict were a whirlwind of interviews, speaking engagements, and legal proceedings as Maya found herself thrust into a role she had never sought: advocate for housing justice and inspiration for ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Housing organizations invited her to speak at conferences, law schools asked her to address students about the power of witness testimony, and community groups sought her advice on organizing against displacement. Maya discovered that she had a gift for speaking about complex issues in ways that made them accessible and urgent. Her background as a waitress had taught her to read people, to understand what they needed to hear, and to communicate with both warmth and clarity. More importantly, her lived experience of poverty and struggle gave her a credibility that experts with advanced degrees could never match. "I'm not an expert on housing policy," she would tell audiences, "but I'm an expert on what it means to be afraid of losing your home, to feel powerless against systems that seem designed to crush ordinary people, to wonder if anyone with influence will ever listen to your story. And I've learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be invisible." The speaking engagements provided supplemental income that allowed Maya to reduce her hours at the diner and accelerate her progress toward completing her accounting degree. But more importantly, they connected her with a network of advocates, organizers, and ordinary citizens who were working to address housing inequality in their own communities. Maya, now 9 years old, adapted to her mother's new prominence with the resilience of childhood. She attended some of Maya's speaking events, sitting in the front row with a mixture of pride and boredom that Maya made her smile every time she caught sight of her daughter's face during presentations. "Mom, why do people want to hurt other people just to make money?" Maya looked up from her accounting textbook, struck by the directness of the question and the impossibility of providing a simple answer. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that some people view other human beings as obstacles to profit? How do you maintain a child's faith in fundamental fairness while acknowledging the systematic nature of injustice? "I think," Maya said finally, "that some people forget that everyone else is a real person with real feelings and real needs.
They get so focused on what they want that they stop seeing other people as human beings who matter just as much as they do. Emma nodded seriously. Like how Mr. Hartwell talked to you at the diner? Exactly like that. He saw me as an obstacle to his convenience rather than a person trying to do her job well.
But you stopped him, Emma said, with the confidence of a child who still believed that justice was a law of nature. We stopped him, Maya corrected. All of us together. The investigators, the other families, the people who testified, the jury who listened to our stories. One person can start something important, but it takes many people working together to create real change. This conversation became the foundation for one of Maya's most requested presentations, Teaching Children About Justice, which focused on age-appropriate ways to help young people understand both the reality of injustice and their own power to address it. The formal sentencing hearing in December provided closure and vindication that exceeded Maya's hopes. Judge Morrison sentenced Richard Hartwell to 7 years in federal prison, ordered him to pay $23 million in restitution to displaced families, and banned him from involvement in residential real estate for life. The Hartwell development empire was dismantled, its assets redistributed to housing organizations and victim compensation funds. But perhaps more significantly, the Department of Justice announced the creation of a new task force dedicated to investigating and prosecuting systematic displacement schemes. The task force would be staffed by investigators who had worked on the Hartwell case and would use the precedents established in Maya's testimony to identify and stop similar operations before they could displace entire communities. Maya attended the sentencing hearing with Emma, Mrs. Patterson, and several of the families from Riverside Apartments. As Judge Morrison read the sentence, Maya felt a sense of completion that went beyond personal vindication. This was justice not just for her humiliation at the diner, but for every family that had been forced from their homes, every child who had been traumatized by displacement, every elderly person who had died in unfamiliar surroundings after being driven from communities they had called home for decades. Richard Hartwell listened to his sentence with the same cold expression Maya remembered from their first encounter. But when he was led away in handcuffs, she saw something in his eyes that might have been the beginning of understanding. Recognition that his victims were real people whose suffering mattered, whose resistance had consequences, whose dignity could not be purchased or destroyed. The winter months that followed brought a different kind of healing to Cedar Falls. The Riverside Apartments underwent renovations funded by the federal restitution order, transforming from declining housing into a model of affordable, dignified living. Mrs. Patterson was elected to the new tenant council, where her decades of teaching experience proved invaluable in organizing residents and advocating for their needs. Chloe and Emma remained best friends, their bond strengthened by the shared experience of watching their community fight back against forces that had seemed overwhelming. Maya continued working at the Sunrise Diner 3 days a week while completing her degree and building her speaking career. The diner had become something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in housing justice, and Maya often found herself serving coffee to activists, researchers, and journalists who wanted to hear her story firsthand. "It's funny," she told Carlos one morning as they prepared for the breakfast rush. "I spent years feeling invisible, like my problems didn't matter to anyone with power. Now people travel hundreds of miles to sit in booth 7 and hear about the day my life changed." Carlos smiled, flipping pancakes with the smooth efficiency of years of practice. "You were never invisible, mija. You just needed the right moment to show everyone what you were made of." But Maya knew that the real victory was not in her personal transformation, but in the systematic changes that had resulted from the case. The precedents established in federal court were being used to investigate similar schemes in dozens of other cities. The documentation methods developed during the investigation had become standard practice for housing advocates. Most importantly, the story of the Hartwell case had spread through networks of community organizers, giving people tools and inspiration to fight back against displacement in their own neighborhoods. Maya received letters from around the country, from single mothers who had successfully challenged rent increases, from elderly residents who had organized against property management companies, from community groups that had prevented the displacement of vulnerable families. Each letter represented someone who had found courage in Maya's story, who had discovered that ordinary people could stand up to systematic injustice and win.
The most important thing about the Hartwell case, Maya would tell audiences, is not that one bad person was held accountable. The most important thing is that we proved systematic displacement can be stopped when communities work together, when people refuse to accept that cruelty is inevitable, when ordinary citizens decide that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. As winter turned to spring, Maya found herself thinking often about the moment in the diner when Richard Hartwell had looked at her with such casual contempt. She realized now that his mistake had not been in treating her badly. His mistake had been in assuming that his treatment of her would have no consequences, that she was powerless to respond, that the system would always protect people like him from people like her. The cufflink that had started everything now sat in a place of honor on Maya's dresser, no longer a symbol of humiliation, but a reminder that small actions could have enormous consequences, that individual courage could create systematic change, that speaking truth to power was not just possible, but necessary. 5 years before our story opens, Maya Rodriguez was serving tables at the Sunrise Diner, struggling to make ends meet as a single mother raising her 7-year-old daughter Emma. She was invisible to most of the world, just another working-class woman trying to survive in an economy that seemed designed to keep people like her down. But everything changed when a wealthy property developer named Richard Hartwell left behind more than just his tip. When Hartwell forgot his expensive cufflink at the diner, Maya faced a choice that would define not just her life, but the lives of countless others. She could have kept the valuable item. After all, Hartwell had shown nothing but contempt for people like her. Instead, she chose to return it, hoping for a moment of human decency in response. What she got instead was casual cruelty. Hartwell not only refused to thank her, but made it clear that he viewed her as beneath his notice, someone whose honesty was expected rather than appreciated, whose dignity was irrelevant to his world. But Maya refused to let that cruelty be the end of the story. Driven by a sense of injustice she couldn't shake, Maya began investigating Richard Hartwell and his business practices. What she discovered was far worse than simple rudeness. Hartwell Development was operating a sophisticated scheme designed to systematically displace vulnerable families from affordable housing. The company would purchase complexes in working-class neighborhoods, then use a calculated pattern of harassment to force out existing tenants. Sudden rent increases, ignored maintenance requests, selective enforcement of lease violations, and deliberate creation of unsafe living conditions were all part of a deliberate strategy to clear buildings of families with children, elderly residents, and anyone Hartwell deemed undesirable. Once these families were displaced, Hartwell would renovate the properties and rent them at much higher prices to more affluent tenants. It was a business model built on the systematic destruction of communities and the exploitation of people who had few resources to fight back.
Maya's investigation revealed that Hartwell's schemes had displaced over 400 families across multiple states, generating millions in profits while leaving families homeless, children traumatized, and communities destroyed. But uncovering the truth was only the beginning. Working with Detective Sarah Chen, community organizer Harold Peterson, and attorney Jennifer Walsh, Maya began building not just a legal case, but a movement.
She helped displaced families document their experiences, connected them with legal resources, and organized community support networks that would become models for advocacy organizations across the country. The investigation was meticulous and comprehensive. Maya and her team documented every rent increase, every ignored maintenance request, and every selective lease violation. They interviewed hundreds of displaced families, uncovering patterns of discrimination that violated both state and federal fair housing laws. Most importantly, they helped these families understand that their experiences were not isolated incidents or personal failures, but symptoms of systematic injustice. When the federal case against Hartwell Development went to trial, Maya's testimony became a defining moment in housing justice advocacy. Her detailed documentation, emotional honesty, and clear articulation of how systematic displacement affected real families helped establish legal precedents that would be cited in housing discrimination cases for decades to come. The trial revealed the full scope of Hartwell's operations, including internal communications that showed the deliberate nature of the discrimination, financial records that documented the profits generated from displacement, and testimony from victims that illustrated the human cost of these policies. Richard Hartwell was convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to significant prison time. More importantly, the case established legal precedents that made it easier for future victims of housing discrimination to seek justice and for federal investigators to prosecute similar schemes. But the story's true power lies not in the conviction of one bad actor, but in the ripples of change that spread from Maya's initial act of courage. Over the following 25 years, the precedents established in the Hartwell case were used to challenge displacement schemes in 34 states, resulting in hundreds of convictions and billions of dollars in restitution for affected families. Maya herself went on to complete her accounting degree summa cum laude while continuing her advocacy work, then attended law school on a full scholarship. She founded the Cedar Falls Housing Justice Center, which became a model for community-based advocacy that was replicated across the country. Eventually, she was appointed as a federal district judge and later became chief judge of the Southern District of Iowa. Her daughter Emma grew up understanding that justice was not just possible, but necessary. Emma earned a doctorate in public policy, became the director of fair housing policy at the Department of Justice, and eventually served as Attorney General of the United States. The Rodriguez family's commitment to justice became a multi-generational legacy. The Hartwell case catalyzed changes that went beyond individual victories. Legal precedents were established that facially neutral policies could still be discriminatory if they produced systematic disadvantages for protected groups. This principle was later applied to digital discrimination and algorithmic bias in housing markets. Federal policy was inspired by the Fair Housing Protection Act signed into law by President Harris, which expanded federal oversight of property management companies and created new penalties for displacement schemes. Educational impact. The Maya Rodriguez School of Social Justice at the University of Iowa became the first institution to offer undergraduate degrees in community advocacy and systematic change, training new generations of housing justice advocates. Cultural shift. Perhaps most importantly, the case helped change how society viewed poverty and housing insecurity, from individual failures to systematic problems requiring systematic solutions. Throughout the narrative, we meet people whose lives were transformed by Maya's courage.
Mrs. Patterson, an elderly resident who learned to document maintenance problems and became a leader in resident-owned affordable housing. Detective Sarah Chen, who was promoted to lead the FBI's Fair Housing Task Force, with her daughter following in her footsteps as a federal prosecutor. Jennifer Lopez, a displaced mother who used restitution money to become a nurse and patient advocate. Maria Lopez, Jennifer's daughter, who became a renowned civil rights lawyer and argued housing discrimination cases before the Supreme Court. Carlos Martinez Sr. and Jr., whose diner became a symbol of dignity and respect for all people regardless of economic circumstances. The story concludes with Maya, now in her 50s, watching new advocates take up the work of justice. Students graduating from programs inspired by her case,
young lawyers using precedents she helped establish, and community organizers employing methods she helped develop, continue the work of ensuring that housing is treated as a human right rather than a commodity. In a particularly moving scene, Maya encounters Sarah Johnson, a college student facing the same kind of systematic displacement that Maya had confronted decades earlier. But this time, the student has access to legal precedents, advocacy organizations, and institutional support that didn't exist when Maya was fighting alone. The movement had created the infrastructure to help the next generation of advocates. This story offers several profound lessons that remain relevant today. Individual actions have collective power. Maya's decision to investigate one act of cruelty revealed systematic injustice affecting hundreds of families. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable. Documentation defeats discrimination. The meticulous documentation that Maya and her allies maintained became crucial evidence in court. Systematic problems require systematic evidence. Community organizing works. Maya didn't fight alone. She built coalitions that included displaced families, community leaders, law enforcement, legal advocates, and ordinary citizens who decided that injustice was unacceptable. Change takes time but is possible. The story spans 25 years, showing how individual courage can create institutional change that protects future generations. Everyone's story matters, from wealthy developers to struggling waitresses. From elderly tenants to young children, the story demonstrates that everyone's dignity matters and everyone's voice has power. As the story concludes, Maya reflects on the bronze statue erected in her honor at the University of Iowa. But she notes that her favorite part isn't the statue itself, but the bench beside it where people sit when they need courage for difficult conversations or strength to challenge injustice. The bench bears a simple plaque, a place for anyone who needs to remember that their story matters, their voice has power, and their actions can change the world. This message captures the essence of the entire story, that ordinary people facing seemingly impossible odds can create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable. And in apartment complexes and diners and courtrooms across the country, new stories are beginning every day. Stories of people who are learning that their voices have power, their actions can change the world, and their courage can create justice where none existed before. Thank you for taking this journey through Maya Rodriguez's extraordinary story. If you found this summary meaningful and want to hear more stories of courage, justice, and transformation, please subscribe to our channel. Your subscription helps us continue sharing stories that matter, stories that remind us of our power to create change, and our responsibility to stand up for what's right. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe that ordinary citizens can do extraordinary things. Together, we can ensure that stories like Maya's continue to inspire new generations of advocates for justice.